Chapter 1. The Ghost of Outpost Theta. The air inside Outpost Theta was heavy with dust and the scent of old fuel, a mixture of stale oxygen and rusted metal that had become as familiar to Jonah Cross as the beat of his own heart. He leaned against the frame of his makeshift workshop, his gaze sweeping over the wasteland beyond. The dying light of a twin-star sunset cast long, jagged shadows across the wreckage of forgotten battles and abandoned freighters, turning the landscape into a maze of twisted steel and sand-covered ruins. Outpost Theta wasn't a city, nor even a proper settlement, was a graveyard of lost things, a place where men like Jonah came to disappear. It had been 3 years since he left the war behind. 3 years since he had walked away from the endless cycle of orders, combat, and death that had once defined his existence. Out here, at the very edge of known space, no one cared about rank or allegiance. There were no sides in the void, only survivors and the dead. Jonah had chosen survival, carving out a quiet life as a scavenger and mechanic, trading spare parts to passing traders and repairing whatever broken machines they brought him. He preferred the solitude. It was easier than dealing with people. But tonight, something felt off. The wind had shifted, carrying a sound he couldn't quite place. A low, metallic thud somewhere in the distance, faint but distinct over the whispering howls of the desert storm brewing at the horizon. Jonah narrowed his eyes, muscles tensing out of old habit. No ships were scheduled to land tonight. The last freighter had passed through 3 days ago, and there were no settlements for hundreds of miles in any direction. Then he heard it again. A ragged breath. Faint, human or close to it. Jonah stiffened, fingers drifting toward the sidearm holstered at his waist. Outpost Theta was supposed to be abandoned. The only living things out here were scavengers, criminals, and the occasional deserter looking to stay lost. And none of them were supposed to be this close to his shelter. He moved cautiously, his boots crunching against the dry, cracked ground, following the sound toward the old refueling station that had been out of service for over a decade. The shell of a crashed transport ship loomed ahead, half buried in the sand like the skeleton of some ancient beast. It had been here for years, its hull torn open by a brutal impact, its insides stripped clean by scavengers long before Jonah had arrived. Nothing lived in there. Nothing should have been in there. But someone was. Jonah stepped inside, gun raised, his pulse steady but his instinct screaming. The air inside the wreck was cooler than the outside, thick with the scent of oil and stale ration packs. He moved deeper, the dim light from his wrist-mounted scanner casting long shadows against the walls. And then he saw her, curled against the farthest corner of the wreckage, half hidden behind a pile of discarded crates, was a woman. No, not a woman. An alien. Her form was humanoid, but her skin shimmered beneath the dim light, shifting subtly between deep purples and midnight blues, like the surface of a starship reflecting a nebula. Her hair was silver white, tangled and matted, cascading over her shoulders in uneven strands. But it was her eyes that struck Jonah first, large, luminous, and filled with raw, unfiltered fear. She was thin, painfully so. Her body looked like it had been starved for weeks, her limbs trembling as she pressed herself further into the wall, her chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. She was weak, too weak to run. Jonah didn't move, didn't speak. He knew better than to make sudden movements around a cornered animal. And this woman, whoever she was, whatever she was, looked exactly like that. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, fragile and ready to snap. Then, finally, Jonah spoke. "You're alive." The alien flinched at the sound of his voice, her hands clenching into fists against the cold metal floor. She said nothing, only watching him with those unblinking, fearful eyes. Jonah exhaled, keeping his posture loose, non-threatening. "I don't know where you came from," he said, voice calm but firm. "But if you're here, that means you need help." Still, she said nothing. Her eyes darted toward his sidearm, and Jonah caught the subtle shift in her muscles. She was preparing to run, even if her body could barely support her. "You're starving," he guessed, his gaze flicking toward the empty ration packs scattered near her feet. The realization hit him like a gut punch. She had been surviving off whatever scraps she could find. Slowly, Jonah holstered his weapon, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I just want to know what the hell happened to you." Still, no response. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes locked onto him. But Jonah could see the exhaustion pulling at her limbs, the way she was barely holding herself together. Jonah sighed, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a sealed ration bar. It wasn't much, just processed protein, compacted for long-term storage, but out here, food was more valuable than credits. He broke it in half, carefully setting one piece on the floor between them before stepping back. "Here," he said. "Eat." The alien didn't move at first. She just stared at the food, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, her fingers twitched. Jonah didn't move. She hesitated only a second longer before her hand snatched up the ration, her body moving with a desperation that made Jonah's stomach twist. She tore into the food, not chewing, barely swallowing, like she expected someone to take it away before she could finish. And then, as soon as the first bite hit her tongue, she froze. Her entire body shuddered, and without warning, her shoulders began to shake. Jonah's chest tightened. Hey, he said quickly, not sure what was happening. "What's wrong?" The alien woman sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers tightening around the ration bar as if she were afraid it might vanish. Then the tears came, silent at first, then harder, her whole frame shaking with quiet, broken sobs. Jonah felt like the air had been punched out of his lungs. She wasn't just crying, she was breaking. And suddenly Jonah realized this wasn't just hunger. This was survival. This was desperation. This was the moment where a lost, starving soul had been given a kindness she hadn't known in far too long. Jonah ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. Whatever had happened to her, whoever she was, this wasn't just an accident. She had been left here. She had been abandoned, and someone had meant for her to die. Chapter 2. The Ones Who Hunt Her. The soft glow of an old lantern cast flickering shadows across the walls of Jonah's workshop, a cramped but sturdy shelter built into the remains of an old mining facility. The place was a mess of scattered tools, salvaged ship parts, and half-repaired machinery, but right now, it served as a temporary sanctuary. The alien woman sat curled against the farthest wall, wrapped in a thick, thermal blanket Jonah had given her. She had stopped crying, but her golden eyes still glistened with unshed tears, her body hunched forward in quiet exhaustion. She hadn't spoken a word. Not when Jonah had led her inside. Not when he had given her more food and a flask of purified water. Not once. Jonah leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, studying her carefully. She was different. Not like any species he had ever seen before. He had traveled across a dozen systems, fought in wars against half the galaxy, and yet her features, her physiology, her very presence felt completely foreign. The way her skin subtly shifted between dark purples and deep blues, reflecting the dim light like the surface of a nebula. The way her hair shimmered silver, falling in tangled waves around her slender frame. Even her movements were strange, too precise, too controlled, yet filled with an underlying fragility. Who was she? Where had she come from? And more importantly, why had she been left to die? Jonah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "All right," he muttered, breaking the silence. "We need to talk." The alien woman tensed, her eyes flicking toward him. He crouched down, careful to keep his movements slow, non-threatening. "You're safe here," he said, "but I need answers. You were half-starved in that wreck. How long have you been out there?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, her lips parted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Days." Jonah's breath hitched. It was the first time he had heard her speak, and her voice was unlike anything he expected. Soft, almost musical, but hoarse, like she hadn't used it in far too long. "Days?" he repeated. "You've been out there for days?" She nodded slowly, her hands tightening around the blanket. "Lost. Cold." Her fingers trembled. "Alone." Jonah clenched his jaw. No one survived in the wastelands of Outpost Theta for that long without supplies, without shelter. The dust storms, the scorching heat during the day, the freezing nights, it was a miracle she was still breathing. "How did you get here?" he asked. She hesitated, her body visibly shaking. "Ship crashed." Jonah's eyes narrowed. He had assumed as much. but something about the way she said it dash asterisk asterisk like the words themselves carried unbearable weight dash asterisk asterisk set off alarms in his mind. Crashed, he repeated slowly. Was it an accident? Her expression shifted. A flicker of something. Darker. And then, she shook her head. Jonah felt his stomach drop. Someone shot you down, didn't they? Her breath caught, but she nodded. Jonah let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. Shit. This wasn't just some random lost traveler. She wasn't here by accident. Someone had wanted her dead and they had failed, which meant they were probably still looking for her. Jonah's mind raced. If someone had shot down her ship, that meant a faction or a mercenary group had targeted her. It also meant there was likely a distress beacon somewhere in that wreckage, sending out a signal. And if there was a signal, it was only a matter of time before they came to finish the job. Jonah exhaled sharply. He needed to think. Fast. A storm on the horizon. An hour passed, and Jonah busied himself with securing the workshop, reinforcing the doors and checking his weapon cache. He had a few old rifles, some EMP grenades, and a half-functioning plasma repeater, but nothing that would hold off a full assault if her pursuers found them. The alien woman sat in silence, watching him carefully. Finally, she spoke again. You are helping me. Jonah glanced at her. Yeah, that a problem? She hesitated. Why? Jonah sighed. Because I don't leave people to die. Her golden eyes studied him, as if searching for something. That is strange. Jonah let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, well, I get that a lot. Another silence stretched between them. Then, she spoke again, softer this time. My name is Saris. Jonah raised an eyebrow. Saris. He let the name settle on his tongue. All right, Saris. You got a last name, or is it just that? She hesitated, then shook her head. Jonah nodded. Okay, Saris it is. She watched him carefully. And you? He smirked. Jonah Cross. Saris repeated the name under her breath, almost as if testing it. Jonah. Yeah. She lowered her gaze. I owe you my life, Jonah Cross. Something in her voice made his chest tighten. She meant it. This wasn't just gratitude, this was an oath. Jonah shifted uncomfortably. You don't owe me anything. Just focus on getting your strength back. Saris looked like she wanted to argue, but she fell silent. And then a proximity alarm blared. Jonah's stomach twisted as he turned toward the security console. A red warning light flashed on the screen, displaying a motion detection alert at the outskirts of the wreckage field. Shit, he muttered, his hands flying over the controls. A ship had just entered the atmosphere. Not a merchant. Not friendly. Saris sat up, her body rigid with fear. They're here, she whispered. Jonah cursed under his breath. They had found her. He grabbed his rifle and turned to her. All right. No more waiting. Tell me who the hell is after you. Saris swallowed hard. They are not soldiers. They are hunters. Jonah frowned. Bounty hunters? She nodded. But not just any. They work for the Syndicate. Jonah's blood ran cold. The Syndicate. A massive, underground network of mercenaries, assassins, and slavers that operated outside the jurisdiction of any galactic government. They didn't take prisoners. And now, they were here. Jonah inhaled sharply, gripping his rifle. All right. Here's the deal, he said. You stick close to me. We fight our way out. We find a way off this rock, and we figure out what the hell they want from you. Saris hesitated, then gave him a slow, resolute nod. Jonah exhaled, glancing at the screen again. The ship had landed. Boots were on the ground. He turned to Saris. Hope you're ready to run. She met his gaze, her fear still there. But something else had taken its place. Determination. She stood, her voice steady. I am ready. Jonah smirked. Good. Outside, in the darkness, the hunters had arrived. And they weren't leaving without their prize. Chapter 3. Hunted in the Wasteland. The wind howled through the wreckage fields of Outpost Theta, carrying with it the scent of scorched metal and decay. The red warning light on Jonah's security console blinked relentlessly, a grim reminder that their enemies had landed. Outside, beyond the safety of his workshop, the desert stretched into the distance silent, waiting. But Jonah knew better. The silence was a lie. He moved quickly, strapping his plasma rifle to his back, grabbing a belt of energy cells and explosives, and loading his sidearm with the kind of efficiency that only came from years of combat experience. He had lived through 2 wars, multiple Black Ops assignments, and a decade of running salvage operations in pirate-infested space. But this was different. Jonah glanced at Saris, who stood at the edge of the room, her golden eyes flickering between determination and fear. She had shed the thermal blanket, standing in the dim glow of the overhead light, her alien skin shifting subtly between deep purples and blues. She looked stronger than before, but Jonah could still see the exhaustion in her movements, the way her body trembled slightly with residual weakness. "You ever fought before?" Jonah asked, tightening the strap on his rifle. Saris hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said, "but not like this." Jonah frowned. "What do you mean?" Saris' expression darkened. "I do not fight to kill." Jonah let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, well, let's hope you change your mind real fast, because those syndicate bastards outside, they don't share that philosophy." Saris looked away, her jaw tightening. Jonah sighed, checking the monitor again. The ship had landed about a kilometer north, near the outermost wreckage fields. The terrain was jagged, uneven, a maze of broken hulls and rusted-out engines. It wasn't much, but it would at least give them some cover. "They'll be moving on foot," Jonah muttered, "probably fanning out, looking for heat signatures. That means we have 2 options." Saris watched him carefully. "Which are?" Jonah met her gaze. "We can stay here and fight, dig in, hope we take them out before they overrun us." He exhaled. "Or we run, try to lose them in the wreckage fields, and hope they don't have drones scanning for movement." Saris blinked. "What do you think is the better option?" Jonah smirked. "I don't know about better, but I sure as hell know which one keeps us breathing longer." She tilted her head. "We run." Jonah nodded. "We run." Into the wreckage fields. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, weaving between rusted-out ship debris and the skeletal remains of forgotten battleships. Jonah led the way, keeping his rifle low and ready, his eyes scanning the terrain for movement. Saris followed behind him, her footsteps unnaturally light, almost as if she were floating rather than running. The wasteland was eerily silent, save for the distant thrum of the Syndicate's ship and the occasional crackle of static from Jonah's scanner. Every now and then, he'd stop, listening, waiting. The air was thick with tension, the kind that wrapped around your throat and squeezed. Then movement. Jonah froze, motioning for Saris to stay low. He pressed himself against the rusted hull of an old starfreighter, peering around the edge. A group of Syndicate hunters moved through the wreckage, their black, tactical armor blending into the darkness. They carried plasma rifles and thermal scanners, their helmets void of any identifying insignias. They moved with precision, sweeping the area in tight formation. Jonah gritted his teeth. They weren't just mercenaries. These guys were professionals. Saris barely breathed. Jonah could feel her tension beside him, the way she curled her fingers into fists, her entire body wound tight like a coiled spring. Then, one of the hunters stopped. He turned his head slightly, as if sensing something. Jonah's grip on his rifle tightened. If they had motion sensors, they were screwed. The Syndicate soldier took a step forward. Jonah's heartbeat slowed to a crawl. Then a sudden explosion in the distance. The mercenary immediately turned his head, his visor scanning the area. Jonah took the chance. He grabbed Saris' wrist and moved, leading her through a narrow corridor of twisted metal, ducking low to avoid detection. "That explosion," Saris whispered as they ran. "Was it?" Jonah smirked. "Not us, but someone else is pissing them off tonight." For the first time, he felt something like hope. Maybe there was another scavenger out here, setting off traps. Maybe there was a malfunction in their ship, causing random energy discharges. Either way, it bought them time. But then a new sound pierced the night. A distant, mechanical whirring. Jonah cursed. "They've got a drone up?" Saris turned sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means we're running out of places to hide." The drone's red scanning light flickered in the distance, sweeping over the wreckage like a predator searching for prey. If it locked onto them, the hunters would pinpoint their exact location. Jonah exhaled sharply. "All right, new plan. We make a break for the canyon pass." Saris frowned. "Canyon pass?" "There's a natural ravine about half a mile from here. Too narrow for ships, too unstable for heavy gear. If we can get there, we might be able to lose them in the rocks. Saris hesitated. And if we don't? Jonah smirked. Then we die tired. The chase. The moment they broke into a sprint, the drone locked onto them. A blaring alarm echoed across the wasteland, and in the distance, Jonah could hear the mercenaries shouting orders. Go! He barked, pulling Saris ahead as plasma fire lit up the night behind them. Bolts of energy sizzled past their heads, striking the metal wreckage with explosive force. Saris moved fast, faster than any human could, her steps barely touching the ground as she surged forward. Jonah kept up as best as he could, his muscles burning with exertion. The canyon was close, he could see it now, just beyond the next ridge. But so were their pursuers. Jonah risked a glance back. The syndicate hunters were closing in, their weapons raised, their visors glowing with cold, unfeeling precision. The drone hovered overhead, tracking their every move. Then a plasma shot grazed Jonah's leg. He stumbled, biting back a curse as pain flared through his thigh. Saris skidded to a stop, turning back. Jonah! Keep moving, he gritted out, forcing himself forward. She hesitated for only a second, then made a decision. She spun, her golden eyes flashing with something ancient, something powerful, and then, for the first time, she fought. With one swift motion, she raised her hand, and the air around her crackled with unseen energy. Jonah barely had time to react before a shockwave erupted from her fingertips, a pulse of violet-blue energy surging outward like a collapsing star. The syndicate hunters flew backward, their weapons ripped from their hands, their armor sparking from the sudden force. Even the drone above them shuddered, its systems glitching out before spiraling into the ground. Jonah stared. Saris panted, her body trembling from the effort. Jonah swallowed hard. Okay, he breathed, gripping his rifle. That was new. Chapter 4. The Truth About Saris. The canyon walls loomed high above them, jagged rock formations twisting toward the sky like ancient sentinels. The air was still thick with the electric residue of Saris energy burst, the scent of scorched metal lingering in the aftermath of the sudden counterattack. The syndicate hunters lay scattered across the wreckage field behind them, either unconscious or struggling to recover. The drone was a smoking husk, its once efficient tracking systems now nothing more than a pile of sparking circuits. Jonah stared at Saris, his breath still coming fast from the chase. He had seen a lot of things in his life, things that should have broken his mind, things that had shattered lesser men, but nothing had prepared him for this. You want to tell me what the hell that was? He asked, keeping his voice low but firm. Saris looked at her hands, her fingers still faintly glowing with residual energy, before slowly closing them into fists. She was breathing hard, her body shaking slightly from exhaustion, but there was something different in her expression now. She was afraid. Not of him, not of the syndicate, of herself. Jonah frowned. He had been in enough battles to recognize the look of someone who had just used a power they didn't fully understand. Saris swallowed hard. I did not mean to, she whispered. It just happened. Jonah crossed his arms. I'm not complaining. You just sent those bastards flying without touching them. If you can do that, we might actually have a shot at surviving this. Saris shook her head violently, her silver-white hair falling over her face. No, she murmured. You don't understand. This power. It is not supposed to be mine. Jonah narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? She looked at him then, her golden eyes full of something ancient, something broken. It means I was never supposed to exist. The secret of her blood. They moved deeper into the canyon, using the high cliffs for cover. Jonah's leg still burned from where the plasma shot had grazed him, but he pushed through it. He had bigger concerns now. Saris walked beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. He could tell she was struggling, wrestling with something deep inside her. Finally, Jonah sighed. All right, no more running in circles. What are you? Saris flinched slightly but didn't stop walking. For a long time, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I am a mistake. Jonah halted in his tracks. The hell does that mean? She turned to face him, and in the dim light of the canyon, her skin shimmered like a dying star. My people do not exist anymore, she said. They were erased, experimented on, hunted, and I am the last. Jonah's stomach tightened. The last of what? He asked. Saris hesitated, then took a slow breath. My kind was created, engineered. We were supposed to be weapons. Jonah felt a cold chill creep up his spine. Weapons. He had heard stories whispers in the darkest corners of the galaxy about secret projects designed to create biological super soldiers. But most of those stories were ghost tales, conspiracy theories. Except Saris was real, and she was standing right in front of him. We were made to fight wars, she continued, her voice trembling. But we were unstable, uncontrollable. Our abilities were unpredictable. Some of us could manipulate energy, bend matter, walk through time itself. But we were not perfect. Our creators feared us. Jonah inhaled slowly. So they decided to wipe you out? She nodded, hugging herself tighter. The syndicate helped. They hunted us down, one by one. Most of my kind did not even realize what they were until it was too late. Her voice broke slightly. I was the only one who escaped. Jonah exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. So that was why the syndicate was after her. She wasn't just some escaped prisoner. She was the last living remnant of a project that was never meant to see the light of day. A living, breathing ghost of a forgotten war. And now, they wanted to finish the job. Jonah clenched his jaw. All right, he muttered. That explains a lot. But there's just one problem. Saris looked up at him. What? Jonah glanced back toward the canyon entrance, toward the distant glow of incoming ships breaking through the atmosphere. They're not done hunting you yet. The final stand. The syndicate had sent reinforcements. Jonah and Saris barely had a few minutes to prepare before a second wave of hunters arrived, their black-armored figures moving with ruthless precision as they entered the canyon. There was no running this time, no escaping. They were trapped. Jonah crouched behind a rocky outcrop, checking his remaining ammo. Not good. He had half a charge left in his rifle, 2 frag grenades, and 1 sidearm that was overheating. He looked at Saris. You got another one of those shockwaves in you? Saris hesitated. I don't know. Jonah grimaced. Not the answer he was hoping for. The first plasma shot whizzed past their heads, slamming into the rock beside them with enough force to send shards of stone flying. Jonah returned fire, taking out the nearest syndicate soldier with a clean shot to the helmet. But more were coming. Too many. Saris, we need a miracle right now, he gritted out. Saris closed her eyes. For a moment, she was still, the sounds of battle fading into the background. Jonah could hear the faint hum of energy building around her, the air around them crackling with raw power. Then she moved. With a single outstretched hand, Saris unleashed another burst of energy, but this time was different. It wasn't just a pulse of raw force. It was controlled. The syndicate soldiers screamed as their weapons shorted out, their armor locking up as electromagnetic pulses fried their systems. A wave of gravitational distortion swept through the canyon, sending the remaining mercenaries crashing into the rocks like ragdolls. And then it was over. The dust settled. Jonah slowly stood up, staring at the devastation around them. The syndicate team was either unconscious or dead. Their ships were fried, their communications jammed. Saris panted, falling to her knees. She looked up at Jonah, her golden eyes glowing softly in the dark. It's over, she whispered. Jonah took a deep breath, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Yeah, he said, offering her his hand. She took it, and just like that she wasn't alone anymore. Epilogue. A new beginning. They left Outpost Theta that night, stealing one of the Syndicate's damaged ships and setting a course for the outer systems. Saris didn't know where she was going. Jonah didn't either. But one thing was clear. She wasn't running alone anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Jonah Cross had something worth fighting for. As the ship disappeared into the infinite black of space, the Syndicate's reach fading behind them, Jonah glanced at Saris. You're not a mistake, he said quietly. Saris looked at him, her golden eyes full of something new, hope. And with that, they disappeared into the stars.